Late on the 29th of November 1943, south of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The Pacific is black. The sea broken only by the white wake of the submarine I-21 jogging to recharge her batteries. On the open bridge, watchstanders taste diesel on the wind and tell themselves that the American carriers that hit Bedio by day are blind and far off after dark. Below, in a narrow control room, red lamps shine on gauges and plotting boards while officers shape a contact report for the 6th Fleet. The beat of the diesels feeding an old belief that night is still Japan's shield. Far beyond the horizon, Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from the escort carrier USS Chenango turn toward I-21's track, riding vectors from shipboard radar and homing flares. At 21:57, the first unnatural growl reaches the submarine's bridge from a sky where no land-based airfield exists, and squat shapes drop out of the darkness. A sudden white beam from a searchlight rips across the waves, fixing E-21's wet hull in its glare, a heartbeat before bombs and depth charges smash into the water. Concussion and spray burying the boat and silencing her unfinished message. In Japanese naval headquarters days later, the loss is only a missing call sign in the Silberts. But staff officers who study the time and reports of aircraft overhead begin to note a new danger: small American baby carriers striking after sunset. A shift in the night the Navy must trace if it hopes to regain the initiative at sea. On a humid night in 1933 in Japan's inland sea, a carrier-borne bomber came down toward what looked, from the cockpit, like a floating hole in the dark. The deck of a training carrier flickered in and out of view as the ship rolled, its thin landing lights swallowed by black water, and the pilot eased the nose down on faith more than sight. His wheels struck with a jolt that shook the hull, and for the officers watching it, confirmed an instinct already common in wardrooms and war games. Darkness and flight decks were a partnership to be avoided. Not the backbone of fleet doctrine. Through the 1930s, that belief hardened. Japanese planners imagined carriers delivering mast, daylight hammer blows, while cruisers and destroyers finished the enemy at night with long-range torpedoes. Darkness belonged to gunfire, not two fragile air groups trying to find short wooden decks. American exercises produced their own record of misjudged approaches, an aircraft lost when the horizon vanished, persuading captains to treat carrier aviation as essentially a daytime weapon. Within that shared mindset, the new escort carriers looked purely utilitarian, converted from merchant and oiler hulls, limited to speeds under 20 knots and air groups of only a few dozen aircraft. They were built to ferry planes, guard convoys, and hover near beach. What began to shift in 1943 was not their hulls but their electronics. New radar sets, improved radios, and compact combat information centers. On even these modest decks let controllers talk aircraft home by instrument and steer them toward unseen contacts. From Tokyo, reports of extra American carriers near New Island landings still fit old assumptions. More decks meant heavier strikes by day. The idea that these auxiliary ships might also erode the supposed safety of night had not yet taken root. A blind spot that would make their first true night blows feel like a doctrinal ambush and lead directly into the next phase of the campaign. By late 1943, as convoys and invasion groups rolled westward across the Pacific, small changes accumulated in the shadows high above the stubby flight decks of American escort carriers. Radar antennas, first lashed to improvised masts and then fixed to sturdier latticework, began sweeping the night, their rotating beams giving even converted oilers and merchant hulls a rough picture of the sky and sea out to dozens of miles. Below decks, spare compartments turned into combat information centers, where officers and enlisted plotters bent over grease pencil circles, translating the electronic echoes into tracks on paper and, through headsets, into calm voices in a pilot's ear. A TBF Avenger or F6F Hellcat returning in rain or overcast no longer had to hunt blindly for a black smudge of a ship. A controller could steer him home with course and altitude calls that turned darkness into something that could be managed. On the aircraft themselves, torpedo bombers and fighters took on unfamiliar bulges and cables as airborne radar sets. Radio altimeters and improved instrument lighting were fitted during refits and depot visits. What began as a handful of modified Avengers and specially equipped Hellcats formed the nucleus of crude night-flying detachments. Their crews learned to trust glowing needles and scopes more than the invisible horizon, easing throttles by reference to dials rather than starlight. On deck, sailors experimented with dimmed strip lighting along the centerline, shielded floodlights at the island, and carefully rehearsed signal lamp patterns that showed just enough to guide a pilot aboard without turning the carrier into an obvious beacon for enemy gunners. In 1943 and early 1944, Sangamon-class escort carriers emerging from yard periods carried standardized radar suites, extra communications lines, and reinforced firefighting systems that made nocturnal launch and recovery cycles barely acceptable risks instead of near-suicidal gambles. Japanese intelligence officers who examined captured components and read decrypted fragments of American radio traffic understood that radar was reshaping the air war. But their mental picture placed such sophistication on the fast fleet carriers of the main task forces. In war games and planning papers, the slow auxiliary carriers remained daytime convoy guards and support platforms, not potential hunters in the dark, a misjudgment that would be exposed only when night strikes began coming from positions that only these modest decks could possibly occupy. On the evening of the 20th of November 1943, as the fires from the first day's assault still flickered over Betio in the Gilbert Islands, Japanese submarine commanders in the Central Pacific assumed that the coming darkness would restore some balance. Reports from Tarawa spoke of heavy American carrier air attacks by day, but long-standing experience told them that transports and escorts would grow blind and vulnerable at night. Their decks quiet, their screens easier to penetrate with torpedoes and prowling small craft. The American escort carriers of Carrier Division 22 had, for most of that brutal week, seemed to confirm that expectation. Sangamon and her sisters spent their days driving off counterattacks and pounding shore positions, then throttled back at dusk, their flight operations curtailed as pilots and deck crews wrestled with fatigue and the old dangers of blacked-out landings. Each night, however, the problem facing their commanders grew sharper. The slower transports and supply ships clustered around the beachhead were prime targets for any submarine willing to close through the darkness, and the first confirmed torpedo attacks underscored how much striking power was being surrendered after sunset. On the 29th of November, under the shadow of Tarawa's still smoldering ruins, the order went out to push beyond the usual limits. Radar-equipped Avengers from the escort groups were tasked to keep searching, even after the last light had bled from the western horizon, using the new instruments and shipboard controllers to feel through overcast skies for signs of enemy boats converging on the invasion fleet. Late that night, one of those patrols made contact and struck a submerged hunter that would later be identified as the submarine I-21, erasing a threat before it could fire and proving that even modest escort carriers could now project lethal power deep into the dark around an amphibious objective. When Japanese naval staff reconstructed the episode from fragmentary radio logs and the absence of further reports from I-21, they faced an unsettling puzzle. Evidence pointed to carrier-based aircraft operating persistently after nightfall in waters where no fast fleet carriers were known to be present. The only plausible platforms were the slow auxiliary carriers they had long dismissed as daylight convoy shepherds. For the moment, the incident could still be written off as a dangerous one-off experiment. In the coming campaigns across the Marshalls and toward the Marianas, however, that assumption would erode under a new reality in which escort carriers maintained pressure not just from dawn to dusk, but across the long Pacific nights as well. In January 1944, as American invasion fleets closed on the Marshall Islands, the lessons drawn from the Gilbert landings took physical form in the way escort carriers were woven into the assault forces. Off Kwajalein and Aro-Inamor, Sangamone, Shenango, and their sisters settled into a new rhythm in which their short decks rarely rested. Avengers and Wildcats cycled between bombing coral gun pits, strafing trenches, and sweeping wide anti-submarine arcs around the transports. The tempo of launches and recoveries stretching toward the thin bands of light at either end of the day. Operations officers, watching the clock and the weather, began to push hard against the old boundaries, authorizing pre-dawn sorties so that fighters were already overhead when the first assault waves moved in, and holding returning patrols until the last possible minutes of usable light. Pilots who had once argued for strict daylight limits now found themselves turning onto final approach with only dimmed deckage lamps and a faint horizon to guide them, trusting the calm voices from the combat information centers and the steady glow of their instruments as the sea and sky blended into grey when the campaign jumped northwest to Iniwal Talk and then further still toward the Marianas that spring and early summer. This pattern followed. Escort carriers shuttled between Ini would talk and the approaches to Saipan and Guam, their aircraft roving ahead to soften beachheads and ranging along the coasts after sunset in search of barges, small craft, and repair parties rushing to restore cratered airstrips. On islands such as Iniwot and Saipan, Japanese garrison officers discovered that the practical margin of darkness available for resupply and movement was shrinking. American planes seemed to appear earlier in the morning and linger later into the evening, their presence nibbling away at the hours when trucks could cross open ground or barges could creep along reef edges. Yet in Tokyo, staff attention remained fixed on the great carrier forces. Battles like the June 1944 clash over the Philippine Sea, remembered for the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, reinforced a belief that decisive air power still resided in fast fleet carriers and daylight duels. Escort carriers were duly noted in reports as valuable auxiliaries tied to convoys and landings. Inside American commands, however, after-action reviews from the Marshalls and Marianas highlighted how a handful of twilight sorties could strangle barge lines, delay runway repairs, and keep coastal shipping under constant threat. A growing appreciation that formed the bridge to a more aggressive idea, turning these small, slow decks into platforms for nearly continuous nocturnal harassment once the invasion routes bent south and west toward the Philippines. On the 20th of October 1944, as American transports poured troops ashore at Leyte in the central Philippines. The sea east of the island was crowded with small, boxy silhouettes whose significance Japanese observers struggled to quantify. Task Group 77.4's 3 Taffy units, 77.4, 177.4.2, and 77.43 mustered 16 escort carriers with roughly 450 aircraft, a floating patchwork of converted merchantmen and oilers whose short decks cycled, Avengers and Hellcats, almost constantly over the beaches and nearby sea lanes. Japanese staff officers poring over reconnaissance reports from Luzon and Mindanao counted these additional flight decks as they updated their estimates of American carrier strength. But in their margin notes, the CVEs remained a distinct category: slow, lightly built auxiliaries tied to MacArthur's invasion convoys, not participants in the kind of decisive air battles they expected to fight by day. In the early hours of the 25th of October, that mental division seemed confirmed by the way the southern arm of the Japanese counterstroke was destroyed. In Surigao Strait, Vice Admiral Nish's force of battleships and cruisers ran into a classic night ambush as American destroyers and PT boats attacked with torpedoes, and Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's older battleships crossed the Japanese T with radar-directed gunfire. The action was decided in darkness by shells, star shells, and torpedoes, with carrier aircraft playing no role until dawn, when planes from the escort groups and fast carriers struck only stragglers and wrecks. 2 Japanese officers reconstructing the battle. Surigao fit comfortably within an old framework. The night belonged to surface forces, while carriers, especially the small ones, remained essentially daytime weapons. That same morning, however, when Kurita's powerful center force burst from San Bernardino Strait and collided with Taffy 3 off Samar, the desperate defense mounted by lightly armed CVEs and their escorts shattered any notion that jeep carriers were harmless. Waves of aircraft clawed into the air with whatever ordnance they had, while the carriers themselves dodged shellfire and destroyers charged heavy cruisers with torpedoes. Post-war interrogations and wartime staff studies alike record the shock in Tokyo as analysts revised American carrier counts upward and acknowledged that these auxiliary decks had multiplied our striking power across multiple beaches and approaches. Yet even then, the pattern of Leyte allowed a comforting assumption to persist. However numerous the carriers had become, their aircraft had not deliberately launched into full darkness from the smallest decks. It would be the grinding campaign for Luzon that finally forced Japanese planners to confront what happened when escort carriers began to challenge the night itself. On the evening of the 9th of January 1945, smoke from burning supply dumps still hung over Lingayen Gulf as the first American assault waves dug in along the beaches and Japanese troops began withdrawing inland toward the Agno River. Columns of infantry, artillery, and horse-drawn carts moved along narrow Luzon roads under orders to regroup in the hills, relying on darkness and scattered cloud to hide them from the carriers they had watched pounding the shoreline all day. For years, veteran officers had taught that when the last light died and the horizon vanished, the sky belonged to no one. Aircraft would stand down, and night movement, though dangerous, was at least possible. But as the first convoys pushed south and east from the Gulf, a slow, mechanical droning rolled in from over the sea, too steady and too high to be trucks or artillery. Men on the road craned their necks to see shadowy shapes sliding across the stars, and within minutes flares hissed to life above crossroads and suspected choke points. turning stretches of highway into harsh white pools where every figure and vehicle stood exposed against the ground. Tracer rounds stitched the verges as night heckler aircraft from the Escort. Carriers in Task Group 77.4 strafed anything that moved and occasionally dropped small bombs on what they thought were assembly areas, forcing regimental commanders to halt movement, disperse, and wait in ditches for the droning engines to fade. In the nights that followed, as the 14th Corps pushed inland toward the Agno, the pattern hardened into a routine. By day, dozens of sorties from the CVEs provided close support and interdiction, hammering Japanese strongpoints in traffic. After dusk, when survivors tried to exploit narrow windows of darkness to shift reserves, the same stubby-decked carriers sent up small detachments of Avengers and fighters to orbit roads, bridges, and river fords. American Army accounts later noted that whenever aircraft were in the vicinity, Japanese units froze in place, and even at night, the presence of carrier-borne patrols was greatly feared by ground troops who knew no friendly fighters would rise to challenge them. Offshore, operations officers on the CVEs wrestled with the limitations of slow, short flight decks, relying on catapult launchers, strict spacing between aircraft, and carefully planned recovery cycles under shielded lights to keep a trickle of planes aloft without losing men to the sea. From Manila and from the few surviving staff ships farther north, reports filtering back to Japanese admirals described something they had not expected. Small carrier groups off Luzon's west coast appeared to maintain aircraft overhead almost around the clock, day and night blending into one long period of threat. For some, the Luzon experience was the first clear sign that American carriers, especially the once dismissed Escort types, were beginning to erase the line between daylight air power and nocturnal safety, an omen that grew more ominous as attention shifted northward toward the Ryukyus and the approaches to Okinawa. Late in January 1945, in a dim room at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, Navy and Army officers bent over maps of Luzon, while clerks laid down fresh interrogation reports from the front. The documents were fragmentary and often confused, but a pattern began to show through the noise. Prisoners spoke of aircraft that circled above roads long after dark, of flares that burst without warning over river crossings, and of engines that returned again and again through the night from the same patch of western sea. Captured field messages from American units mentioned small carriers by designation. The same Escort type's reconnaissance had sighted off Lingayen by day. Yet the pilots described taking off into full darkness and homing back on instruments as if such sorties were now routine. For staff officers who had spent years plotting carrier groups only in terms of daylight raids and deck capacities, the implication was unsettling. The auxiliary decks, riding with each amphibious force, were no longer shutting down with the sun, as more frontline accounts arrived from Luzon, Formosa, and the South China Sea. Some of them exaggerated by fear and fatigue. The sense of imbalance deepened, battalion and regiment level. Reports complained of planes that never stop and small carriers. Everywhere, phrases that filtered into intelligence, summaries and staff conferences, and fed a perception that American naval aviation had become almost inexhaustible. Analysts who once counted US carrier strength by tallying only the big fleet holes now had to add clusters of CVEs, each apparently able to feed radar-equipped aircraft into the night skies over threatened coasts. In the same files lay reminders of Japan's condition. Carrier air groups shattered in the Philippine Sea and battered again over Formosa. Fuel and aircraft in short supply, training pipelines broken so badly that even basic night flying was difficult to sustain. Plans for the defense of Formosa, the South China Sea routes, and ultimately Okinawa began to include notes about expected nocturnal harassment from sea-based aircraft, but proposed countermeasures, greater dispersal, camouflage. A few more searchlights and guns read more like gestures than solutions. The growing conviction that the Americans now possessed small carriers that never rest gave late war staff meetings a tone of urgency edged with quiet despair, a mood that would follow planners into the final preparations for the Ryukyus and the looming test around Okinawa. Before dawn on the 1st of April 1945, the first day of Operation Iceberg, Japanese air officers responsible for the Ryukyus watched weather reports and reconnaissance plots of the American fleets off Okinawa, knowing that the coming battle would hinge on whether kamikaze strikes could break through. In the pre-dawn gloom, the first carrier aircraft they heard were familiar. Heavy waves of fighters and bombers from the fast carriers, roaring in to plaster coastal defenses and inland positions before the invasion beaches filled with landing craft. What unsettled them was what came afterward. As the main raids receded and anti-aircraft crews stood down, smaller groups of aircraft, often only a few contacts on a plotting board, kept appearing over Miyako, Ishigaki, and the other Sakishima Islands. Reports from garrison commanders spoke of nuisance attacks that arrived not only at dawn and dusk but well into the night, dropping bombs on runway repair crews, strafing parked aircraft, and circling slowly above airfields that were supposed to be safe for kamikaze, staging once the main raids had passed. Out to the south and east of Okinawa, escort carriers such as Sangamon had been folded into the complex screen of the invasion force, their short decks launching closer port sorties by day and then shifting, as the weeks wore on, to a deliberate pattern of dawn, evening, and full-night missions aimed at the airfields feeding suicide attacks. One American account described Sangamon as flying morning and evening strikes and then heckler flights over airstrips at night, with radar-equipped Avengers and fighters sent specifically to keep Japanese pilots from resting, assembling, or lining up for takeoff under cover of darkness. Post-war analyses by U.S. planners judged that these night heckler missions were among the most effective ways to disrupt kamikaze raids before they ever reached their run-in points, not by destroying every aircraft, but by scattering preparations and fraying nerves. For Japanese air and naval commanders on Kyushu and in the home islands, situation reports from the Okinawa sector painted a grim picture. Airfields around the Ryukyus could now be struck at any hour, and the small American carriers providing much of this pressure were themselves proving hard to silence. Even when individual CVEs like Sangamon suffered kamikaze hits and returned to service after repair, the sense that the enemy possessed small carriers that never rest weighed heavily on late war staff calculations, shaping how they imagined the final defense of the home islands even as those same carriers continued to circle patiently off Okinawa's embattled shores in 1943, while Japanese shipyards struggled to repair damaged carriers and replace aircraft lost over the Solomons and the Central Pacific. An entirely different scale of production was taking shape on the American West Coast, at yards including Henry Kaiser's assembly line operations. Hull after hull slid down the ways, around 50 new escort carriers in that year alone. Half-length flight decks built on merchant and oiler designs that could each carry roughly 24 to 30 aircraft. Individually, they were modest, with air groups often centered around about 27 Avengers and Wildcats or Hellcats. but in aggregate they formed a lattice of decks that planners could distribute to every major amphibious operation. As soon as one CVE left the fitting-out pier, another took its place. And by the time Sangamon and her sisters were flying night sorties off Okinawa, the idea of a lone, irreplaceable carrier was foreign to American logistics, in a way Japanese. Admirals could hardly imagine refits, and upgrades turned these hastily built hulls into platforms, capable of playing their part in a midnight air war. Yard periods added rocket stowage, extra or improved catapults, strengthened arresting gear, and standardized radar suites. Sangamon's pre-Okinawa modifications were typical: better radar, reinforced flight deck fittings, and refined firefighting systems designed specifically to survive prolonged operations under attack. Fuel lines, bomb hoists, and ammunition magazines were rearranged so that deck crews could keep a cycle of aircraft, moving from hangar to catapult in the cramped spaces of a small carrier. Even when sorties stretched from before dawn into full darkness, behind the flight deck, an intricate chain of support ships made such endurance possible. Oilers topped off bunker tanks. Ammunition ships and barges replenished bombs, rockets, and machine gun belts. Repair tenders and floating workshops handled the damage that would once have put a carrier out of action for months. The human side of the system matched the steel. Pilot training pipelines produced aviators drilled in instrument flying and basic radar usage, so that an escort carrier air group could always spare some men for night patrols and heckler missions. Maintenance crews learned to service fragile electronic sets under red lights in cramped hangars, swapping out vacuum tubes and coaxial cables between sorties while the ship rolled. From the Japanese side of the horizon, the result looked like a swarm that could not be worn down. Intercepted radio traffic and visual sightings showed fresh groups of small carriers and support ships arriving with each new campaign, reinforcing the impression that the PR Americans could absorb the inevitable accidents and combat losses that came with night flying and simply send more planes. In that imbalance lay a harsh, strategic reality. Once the US Navy decided that escort carriers would help carry the air war into the hours after midnight, there was no realistic prospect that the overstrained Japanese fleet could exhaust, outlast, or materially blunt that effort. A realization that colored every late war decision even before anyone had time to ask what lessons this new, round-the-clock carrier warfare would leave for the future. By late 1944, as word of new American techniques filtered through the ranks, Japanese soldiers and sailors began to talk about the night itself as something that had turned against them. Training lectures that had once described darkness as an ally now came with warnings about sudden flares and strafing passes from unseen aircraft. On Luzon in January 1945, that anxiety became personal. Army narratives from units retreating from Lingayen Gulf toward the interior describe how a faint, distant drone after dark could bring entire columns to a standstill. Men crouched in ditches or under carts while night heckler patrols from the escort carriers circled overhead, dropping parachute flares that flooded narrow roads and river fords with white light, followed by short bursts of machine gun fire or a few bombs hurled at whatever moved. Even when no one was hit, the lesson repeated itself. As long as engines could be heard, movement meant exposure. In interviews and letters later recovered, soldiers wrote of shoulders tensing at the slightest sound in the sky, of officers abandoning carefully timed night marches, because no hour felt truly safe. The strain deepened during the Okinawa campaign. Kamikaze pilots and ground crews tasked with preparing aircraft for dawn, sorties found, themselves working under the threat of rockets and bombs from escort carrier Avengers and fighters that returned again and again to harass staging airfields in the small hours. Men who were already steeling themselves for one-way missions now watched runways cratered, fuel dumps burning, and comrades killed on the ground before they could ever take off. Some surviving accounts recall a sense that even fate was being cheated of its proper order, instead of a final, controlled attack at a chosen time. There was the constant possibility of dying anonymously in a flare-lit blast long before reaching the enemy. In fleet headquarters and area command posts, admirals and staff officers who had once planned surface movements and air deployments around expected daylight pauses were forced into a new calculus in which there was no predictable lull. Reports from Luzon, the East China Sea, and Okinawa all told the same story. American aircraft, many of them from the small carriers that had once seemed marginal, could appear at almost any hour. Yet the psychological burden was not all on one side. For American pilots and deck crews on the escort carriers, the shift into night operations meant living with a different kind of fear. Aviators launching into blackness from short, heaving decks knew that a moment's error on landing could bounce them into barriers, send them skidding over the side, or leave them in the water with only a faint chance of rescue. Landing signal officers and deck handlers worked under shielded lights, guiding home tired men whose only horizon was a smear of instruments. Many memoirs speak of the silence in ready rooms after a night recovery cycle, when an empty chair marked the man who had not come back. At the same time, those same crews took a fierce pride in mastering what had once been declared impossible for their small ships. Each successful heckler run over a Japanese airfield, each patrol that broke up a column on a dark road, felt like proof that they had seized control not only of sea lanes, but of the clock itself. By 1945, the asymmetry in perception was stark. For Japanese troops, sailors, and planners, the escort carriers' night raids fed a narrative of encirclement and inevitability. While for Allied crews, they confirmed a sense of unstoppable momentum. That emotional gulf would shape how both sides remembered the last campaigns and how post-war navies tried to understand what it meant that, by the end, darkness no longer belonged to either side, but to those who could turn it into a weapon. By the middle of 1945, the pattern that had first emerged off Luzon had hardened into a strategic fact. Around that island, escort carriers had already shown how continuous day and night air pressure could make it hazardous for Japanese surface forces too, sortie and difficult for submarines to slip through the passages that led toward the South China Sea. By the time the Okinawa campaign reached its bloody peak, the combined presence of CVEs and fleet carriers had turned the waters around the Ryukyus into a zone where movement by ship or barge was risky at almost any hour. Anti-submarine patrols from escort carriers flew in low cloud and rain along likely approach routes, complementing the work of American submarines and tightening the maritime blockade that starved Japan's fuel and supply lines. 4 Japanese commanders trying to husband dwindling resources for a decisive effort. The sea itself seemed to have become a net in which every transit risked detection from above. The airfields feeding the kamikaze effort faced a similar squeeze. At Okinawa, persistent night heckler missions from CVEs and larger carriers did not always inflict heavy physical damage. But us analyzers after the campaign concluded that they ranked among the most effective tools for disrupting suicide raid preparations. Each flare-lit pass and sudden rocket attack forced Japanese air officers to disperse aircraft, launch before units were fully assembled, or postpone operations until the window for a coordinated blow had closed. Over time, the effect was cumulative. Kamikaze strikes reached the fleet in smaller, less synchronized waves, while fuel and aircraft burned on runways that were never quite safe. Strategically, the demonstrated ability of even small carriers to help sustain round-the-clock operations fed directly into Allied planning for a possible invasion of the home islands, where amphibious forces were now expected to enjoy some measure of air cover and harassment at any hour. For Japanese naval leaders whose pre-war doctrine had relied on choosing the time and place of battle, the realization that American air power now flowed almost continuously from both fleet and escort decks eroded the last hopes of engineering a sudden reversal. Yet, this transformation had been achieved with ships that were, in many ways, fragile and overworked, a contradiction that leads directly into the question of what it costs to wage a midnight air war from the smallest carriers afloat. In the autumn of 1943, when the first escort carriers began stretching their flight schedules into the long edges of night, it became clear that this new capability lived on a narrow ledge between success and disaster. Early trials with instrument approaches on short, rolling decks produced more than a few wrecked aircraft and deck fires. Reminders that a small ship's motion could turn a routine landing into a blind gamble the moment the horizon disappeared. Sangamon's own wartime record read like a ledger of these risks, converted from an oiler and pressed into sustained combat service. She endured accidental crashes that tore into parked aircraft, fuel spills that caught fire under the slipstream of propellers, and damage from near misses that warped plating and shook fittings loose. Each incident underscored how thin the margin really was when heavily laden Avengers came aboard at night, landing close to the bow instead of the barriers, or bouncing toward the deck edge while the carrier rolled under their wheels as the war moved. Into 1944 and 1945, night flying from CVEs remained a specialized craft. True carrier night fighter development concentrated on a limited number of squadrons with radar-equipped Hellcats and specially trained crews, and only some escort carriers could spare space and support for such units. Many others relied on a handful of instrument-traded pilots within their regular air groups to shoulder the most hazardous missions. Men who flew the same paths again and again until fatigue, weather, or a minor mechanical failure forced them to abort or divert to a land base rather than risk a dark recovery. In heavy seas, operations officers pared back sortie plans, accepting that the night war they were fighting would be one of harassment and interdiction, not massed bombing. American commanders adapted by keeping night strikes deliberately small, limiting them to heckler runs over roads and airfields, and by rotating CVEs out of the line for refits that added better radar, additional catapult capacity, and improved deck lighting to claw back a little safety from the sea. The Japanese watched these limits with interest and tried to exploit them. Operational orders called for concentrated kamikaze attacks on escort carriers, whose small decks and light protection made them inviting targets. And surviving records show plans for night surface thrusts aimed at CVE groups when radar coverage seemed thin. Sangamon's near-fatal kamikaze hit off Okinawa in May 1945, which burned her flight deck and forced lengthy repairs, showed how vulnerable such ships could be when an attacker did break through. But by then, pilot quality had eroded so badly and radar inferiority was so stark that these late efforts rarely aligned with the fleeting opportunities the night presented. The reality that escort carriers could fight after dark only with difficulty and at real cost does not diminish their impact. Instead, it adds texture to their story, setting the stage for a final reckoning with how this improvised night war nonetheless reshaped the future of carrier operations long after the last CVE left service. On a humid night in July 1945, as cicadas rasped over the dark gardens around the Imperial Palace and a thin haze hung above Tokyo, a senior naval staff officer stood over a plotting table and traced yet another ring of American positions around the home islands. The latest reports from the south spoke of carrier groups off the Ryukyus and east of Kyushu, whose aircraft did not rest with the setting sun. Field messages from Luzon and Okinawa lay in folders at his elbow, still marked with phrases that had once sounded like exaggeration. Planes that never stop. Small carriers everywhere. Airfields attacked again at night. Now, with radar tracks and intercepted traffic confirming persistent nocturnal patrols from both fleet and escort carriers. They read instead like a simple description of the new order at sea, one in which there was no hour that could be called safe. The ocean that had once promised concealment after sunset had become a black stage on which past American air power moved almost without pause. The modest CVEs multiplying the number of flight decks from which darkness itself could be turned into a weapon. On the other side of that horizon, the same nights were marked by a different kind of strain. American pilots, who never saw their carrier's silhouette until the last seconds of a blind approach. Deck crews fighting fires and clearing wrecks under dimmed lights. Empty chairs in ready rooms when someone failed to return. Yet by the time the guns fell silent in August, those sacrifices had helped prove a decisive point. Even the smallest flat tops could help erase the old distinction between day and night at sea, forcing any future admiral in any navy to plan for a world in which true 24-hour carrier operations were not an experiment but a requirement. The Black Pacific that had once shielded fleets now belonged to the glow of flight decks stretching to every horizon.